Case Blue, later renamed Operation Braunschweig, was the German armed forces' name for its plan for the 1942 strategic summer offensive in southern Russia between the 28th of June and the 24th of November 1942. The operation was a continuation of the previous year's Operation Barbarossa, intended to knock the Soviet Union out of the war, and involved a two-pronged attack against the oil fields of Baku as well as an advance in the direction of Stalingrad along the Volga River, to cover the flanks of the advance towards Baku. For this part of the operation, Army Group south of the German Army was divided into Army Groups A and B. Army Group A was tasked with crossing the Caucasus Mountains to reach the Baku oil fields, while Army Group B protected its flanks along the Volga. Initially, the offensive saw gains, with an advance into the Caucasus capturing large areas of land and several oil fields. However, the Red Army defeated the Germans at Stalingrad, following Operations Uranus and Little Satin. This defeat forced the Axis to retreat from the Caucasus. Only the city of Kursk and the Kuban region remained tentatively occupied by Axis troops. Axis strategy. Background. On the 22nd of June 1941, the Wehrmacht had launched Operation Barbarossa with the intention of defeating the Soviets in a blitzkrieg lasting only months. The Axis offensive had met with initial success and the Red Army had suffered some major defeats before halting the Axis units at Moscow. Although the Germans had captured vast areas of land and important industrial centers, the Soviet Union remained in the war. In the winter of 1941-42, the Soviets struck back in a series of successful counteroffensives, pushing back the German threat to Moscow. Despite these setbacks, Hitler wanted an offensive solution, for which he required the oil resources of the Caucasus. By February 1942, the German Army High Command had begun to develop plans for a follow-up campaign to the aborted Barbarossa offensive, with the Caucasus as its principal objective. On the 5th of April 1942, Hitler laid out the elements of the plan now known as Case Blue, Infera Directive No. 41. The directive stated the main goals of the 1942 summer campaign on Germany's Eastern Front: holding attacks for Army Group Center, the capture of Leningrad and the link-up with Finland for AG North, and the capture of the Caucasus region for Army Group South. The oil fields. The Caucasus, a large culturally diverse region traversed by its eponymous mountains, is bounded by the Black Sea to the west and the Caspian Sea to the east. The region north of the mountains was a production center for grain, cotton and heavy farm machinery, while its two main oil fields at Maykop, near the Black Sea, and Grozny, about halfway between the Black and the Caspian Seas, produced about 10% of all Soviet oil. South of the mountains lay the densely populated region of Transcaucasia, comprising Georgia, Azerbaijan and Armenia. This heavily industrialized and densely populated area contained some of the largest oil fields in the world. Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, was one of the richest, producing 80% of the Soviet Union's oil, about 24 million tons in 1942 alone. The Caucasus also possessed plentiful coal and peat, as well as non-ferrous and rare metals. Manganese deposits at Chiaturi, in Transcaucasia, formed the richest single source in the world, yielding 1.5 million tons of manganese ore annually, half of the Soviet Union's total production. The Kuban region of the Caucasus also contained vast swaths of wheat, corn, sunflower seeds and sugar beets, all essential in the production of food. These resources were of immense importance to Hitler and the German war effort. Of the 3 million tons of oil Germany consumed per year, 85% was imported, mainly from the United States, Venezuela and Iran. When war broke out in September 1939, The British naval blockade cut Germany off from the Americas and the Middle East, leaving the country reliant on oil-rich European countries such as Romania to supply the resource. An indication of German reliance on Romania is evident from its oil consumption. In 1938, just one-third of the 7,500,000 tons consumed by Germany came from domestic stocks. Oil had always been Germany's Achilles heel, and by the end of 1941, Hitler had nearly exhausted Germany's reserves, which left him with only two significant sources of oil: the country's own synthetic production and the Romanian oil fields, with the latter supplying 75% of Germany's oil imports in 1941. Aware of his declining oil resources and fearful of enemy air attacks on Romania, Germany's main source of crude oil, Hitler's strategy was increasingly driven by the need to protect Romania and acquire new resources, essential if he wanted to continue waging a prolonged war against a growing list of enemies. In late 1941, the Romanians warned Hitler that the stocks were exhausted and they were unable to meet German demands. For these reasons, the Soviet oil fields were extremely important to Germany's industry and armed forces. As the war became global, the power of the Allies grew, and shortages started to occur in Axis resources. Planning Axis forces. The offensive was to be conducted across the southern Russian steppe utilizing the following Army Group units: Army Group A under Wilhelm List 1st Panzer Army, 17th Army, 3rd Romanian Army, 11th Army; Army Group B under Maximilian von Weich's 2nd Army, 4th Panzer Army, 6th Army, 2nd Hungarian Army, 4th Romanian Army, 8th Italian Army. Luftflotte under Alexander Law, 8th Air Corps, 4th Air Corps. German air strength in the east numbered 2,644 aircraft on the 20th of June 1942, over 20% more than a month earlier, whereas in 1941 most units fought on the Central Front supporting Army Group Center. 1,610 aircraft supported Army Group South, initially commanded by Law. On the 20th of July 1942, Wolfram Freiherr von Richthofen took command of Luftflotte 4. The German plan involved a three-staged attack. Blau I, 4th Panzer Army, commanded by Hermann Hoth, and the 2nd Army, supported by the 2nd Hungarian Army, would attack from Kursk to Voronezh and continue the advance, anchoring the northern flank of the offensive towards the Volga. Blau II, 6th Army, commanded by Friedrich Paulus, would attack from Kharkiv and move in parallel with 4th Panzer Army, to reach the Volga at Stalingrad. Blau III, 1st Panzer Army would then strike south towards the lower Don River, with 17th Army on the western flank and 4th Romanian Army on the eastern flank. The strategic objectives of the operation were the oil fields at Makop, Grozny and Baku. As in Barbarossa, these movements were expected to result in a series of grand encirclements of Soviet troops. Soviet forces. The Soviet Army Command failed to discern the direction of the main German strategic offensive anticipated in 1942, even though they were in possession of the German plans. On the 19th of June, the Chief of Operations of the 23rd Panzer Division, Major Joachim Reichel, was shot down over Soviet-held territory while flying an observation aircraft over the front near Kharkov. The Soviets recovered maps from his aircraft detailing the exact German plans for Case Blue. The plans were handed over to Stavka in Moscow. Joseph Stalin, however, believed it to be a German ruse, remaining convinced that the primary German strategic goal in 1942 would be Moscow, in part due to Operation Kremlin, a German deception plan aimed at the city. As a result, the majority of Red Army troops were deployed there, although the direction from which the Case Blue offensive would come was still defended by the Bryansk, southwestern, southern and North Caucasian fronts, with about 1 million soldiers at the front line and another 1.7 million in reserve armies. The forces accounted for about 1/4 of all Soviet troops. Following the disastrous start of Case Blue from the Soviets, they reorganized the front lines several times. Over the course of the campaign, the Soviets also fielded the Voronezh Front, Don Front, Stalingrad Front, Transcaucasian Front, and the Caucasian Front, though not all existed at the same time. With the German thrust expected in the north, Stauke planned several local offensives in the south to weaken the Germans. The most important of these was aimed at the city of Kharkov and would be conducted mainly by the Southwestern Front under Semyon Timoshenko, supported by the Southern Front commanded by Rodion Malinovsky. The operation was scheduled for the 12th of May, just prior to a planned German offensive in the area. The ensuing Second Battle of Kharkov ended in disaster for the Soviets, severely weakening the mobile forces. At the same time, the Axis clearing of the Kerch Peninsula together with the Battle of Sevastopol, which lasted until July, weakened the Soviets further and allowed the Germans to supply Army Group A across the Kerch Peninsula through the Kuban.